You don't have the legal standing. With these documents, we do. Impossible!
It's all here, just as you suspected.
Thank you. I can't believe it.
You've shown incredible courage and commitment.
Thank you. This means everything.
No, the honor is all ours.
The easiest person to underestimate is the one who never feels the need to prove who they are. Those were the words Olivia Bennett would remember later, long after the conference room had gone silent and long after the people who laughed that morning wished they had chosen their words more carefully. At 11:17 on a rainy Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, Olivia sat quietly at the end of a polished conference table on the 34th floor of Hayes Corporate Center. The glass walls overlooked miles of gray skyline, the Chicago River, and rows of buildings that disappeared into the cloudy horizon. Around her, executives reviewed quarterly reports while assistants moved in and out carrying folders, coffee, and laptops. Olivia had worked in the building for 5 years. At least that was what everyone believed. To most employees, she was simply the quiet assistant from the administrative department. She arrived early, left late, never complained, and rarely spoke unless someone asked her a direct question. She wore simple navy blazers, sensible shoes, and carried the same leather notebook every day. Few people remembered her birthday. Fewer remembered her last name. That morning, Richard Hayes stood at the head of the room, radiating confidence. At 52 years old, he had built a reputation as a brilliant executive who demanded excellence and tolerated nothing less. Investors respected him. Employees feared him. Richard believed he could read people within seconds of meeting them, and he had long decided Olivia Bennett was unremarkable. The meeting had already gone poorly. A presentation file had failed to load properly moments before a major client call. Tension spread through the room. Executives exchanged nervous looks. Richard's patience evaporated. "Who was responsible for preparing these materials?" he asked sharply. The room fell silent. Someone glanced toward Olivia. Then another person did the same. Richard followed their eyes. "Olivia," he said, "was this your responsibility?" Olivia calmly opened her notebook. "The presentation was finalized by the marketing division yesterday evening," she replied. "I distributed the approved version this morning." Richard folded his arms. "So now it's someone else's fault?" A few uncomfortable laughs escaped around the table. Olivia remained composed. "I'm only explaining the process." Richard stepped closer. The process failed. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended her. Outside the windows, rain streaked down the glass. Inside, every eye stayed fixed on the exchange. Richard shook his head with visible frustration. "You know what the problem is?" he said. "People stay in positions they've outgrown because others feel sorry for them." The room became even quieter. Olivia met his gaze without anger, without fear. "Sir," she said gently, "I don't believe that's relevant." Richard laughed. "It's relevant today." He pointed toward the door. "Effective immediately, your employment is terminated." Several people lowered their eyes. Others pretended to review documents. Nobody intervened. Olivia sat still for a moment. Then she closed her notebook, gathered her folder, and rose from her chair. There was no argument. No plea. No emotional reaction. That silence unsettled a few people more than any protest would have. Richard expected resistance. Instead, Olivia simply nodded once. Then she said something that would remain in the minds of everyone in that room for weeks. "Thank you for your honesty." Olivia walked calmly out of the conference room, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor as she passed colleagues who stared in awkward silence, unsure whether to offer sympathy or to avert their eyes entirely. The elevator doors opened, revealing a narrow space crowded with employees returning from meetings and phone calls, all of them whispering under their breath while sneaking glances at the woman they had just seen dismissed in front of the entire executive team. Olivia stepped in without hesitation, pressed the button for the lobby, and leaned against the wall with a subtle poise that drew attention even from the busiest of minds. She held her folder tightly against her chest, the leather slightly worn from years of use, but she carried it with the kind of dignity that betrayed nothing about the storm that had just passed in that room above. As the elevator descended, she felt the subtle shift in energy, the curious glances that she had grown accustomed to over her years in the building, the unspoken questions lingering in the minds of those around her. Who was she really, and why did she remain so composed when others would have faltered? The doors opened onto the polished lobby, where the reception desk gleamed under the natural light pouring through the massive glass panes. Security cameras recorded the flow of employees, as if capturing a subtle narrative that only Olivia could interpret fully. The receptionist, a young woman named Karen, looked up and hesitated, a brief flicker of recognition crossing her face before she smiled politely and returned to her work. Olivia nodded to her, acknowledging the small gesture, then moved toward the main entrance. Outside, the rain had eased into a light drizzle, leaving reflective puddles along the sidewalks and casting a soft glow from the streetlights onto the wet pavement. Passers-by paid little attention, absorbed in their own routines, but the sight of Olivia striding forward with calm assurance created an invisible boundary of respect around her, a silent acknowledgement that she was not simply the assistant they had underestimated moments ago. She paused briefly at the curb to wait for the traffic light, and in that short moment, a janitor pushing a cart of supplies nodded toward her with a subtle smile, a quiet recognition of her composure and intelligence that contrasted sharply with the scorn she had faced minutes before. Olivia crossed the street with measured steps, each footfall echoing softly in the quiet morning, and she reflected on the irony of the situation. The same people who had laughed, pointed, and whispered would soon learn that the calm, quiet presence they had dismissed carried far more influence than any of them had ever imagined. She entered the small coffee shop at the corner, a habitual stop she made on mornings when the city was still waking, and ordered a cup of black coffee, savoring the warmth and familiar aroma, a small but deliberate ritual to reclaim her sense of control in a world that had momentarily tried to take it away. As she sipped the coffee, she scanned the street through the large front window, her eyes taking in the movement of cars, pedestrians, and the early morning activity, all the while plotting the next steps in her unspoken plan, steps that would ensure that the lessons of humility and foresight would reach those who had believed themselves untouchable in their assumptions. And she smiled faintly to herself, a quiet acknowledgement that patience, observation, and poise were powers far greater than arrogance or temporary authority could ever achieve. Back at Hayes Corporate Center, the atmosphere had already shifted. By early afternoon, most employees had moved on from the morning incident, treating it as another piece of office gossip destined to fade beneath deadlines and meetings. Richard Hayes certainly had. In his corner office overlooking the Chicago skyline, he stood confidently beside the floor-to-ceiling windows while reviewing the final documents for what he considered the most important deal of his career. If everything went according to plan, the acquisition scheduled for that afternoon would expand the company into 3 additional states and generate tens of millions of dollars in projected revenue over the next 5 years. Investors were excited. Board members were optimistic. Financial analysts had already begun predicting a major surge in the company's value. Richard enjoyed every minute of it. He believed success validated every decision he made, including the one he had made earlier that morning. Seated across from him, Monica Reed reviewed her tablet while discussing the schedule for the upcoming board meeting. The attorneys should arrive around 3 o'clock, she said. The investors will join remotely, and the final vote is expected before 4. Richard smiled. Perfect. By the end of the day, this company will be operating on an entirely different level. Monica hesitated briefly before speaking again. There is one thing. Human Resources received several emails regarding the situation this morning. Richard waved dismissively. People always complain when someone gets fired. Some employees thought it was handled too publicly. Richard laughed. Then they should focus on their jobs instead of their feelings. Monica nodded, although she did not appear entirely convinced. Meanwhile, several floors below, rumors continued spreading through the building. Employees gathered near break rooms and workstations, discussing Olivia's departure. Most assumed she would never return. A few wondered why she had remained so calm. Others remembered small details that suddenly seemed unusual. One employee recalled seeing her enter restricted meetings that ordinary assistants never attended. Another remembered a security supervisor greeting her with unusual respect. A third mentioned that senior legal staff often seemed to know her by name. None of it made sense. Around 2:30, Richard entered the executive conference room where preparations for the acquisition meeting were underway. Assistants arranged folders at every seat. Screens displayed financial projections. Catering staff delivered refreshments. Everything appeared flawless. Richard took his place at the head of the long conference table and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. This was the future he had worked toward for years. The board members gradually arrived. Attorneys entered carrying leather briefcases. Investors joined through large video screens mounted on the walls. Then, just as the meeting was about to begin, the conference room doors opened once more. A man none of the executives recognized stepped inside. He appeared to be in his late 60s, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, carrying a thin black portfolio. His presence immediately commanded attention. Without asking permission, he took a seat near the center of the table. Richard frowned. "I am sorry," he said. "I believe there has been a mistake. This meeting is private." The man calmly placed the portfolio on the table. "No mistake, Mr. Hayes," he replied. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be." Several board members exchanged confused looks. Richard leaned forward. "And who exactly are you?" The man offered a polite smile. "My name is Charles Whitaker. I am legal counsel representing the primary ownership trust connected to this property." For the first time all day, Richard's confidence faltered, because he had spent years operating inside this building without ever hearing that name before. Charles Whitaker opened his black portfolio and carefully removed a set of documents bound with a thin, black ribbon. The board members leaned in, curiosity overtaking the earlier tension in the room. Richard adjusted his tie, trying to maintain a semblance of composure, but the faint flicker of uncertainty betrayed him. Charles placed the documents on the table in front of him and began to speak in a calm, deliberate voice that demanded attention. "These papers outline the ownership and the terms of control for Hayes Corporate Center. The primary beneficiary, as stated explicitly in the trust, is Ms. Olivia Bennett." The room went silent. Eyes widened. Some board members gasped softly. Others exchanged confused glances. Monica Reed's hand hovered over her tablet, unsure whether to scroll for a confirmation or to speak. Richard's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. "Ms. Bennett," Charles continued, "has been the controlling party of this property for over 5 years. Her decision to maintain her role as an assistant has been entirely intentional to observe the operations and the treatment of employees, ensuring the company's culture and values align with the standards she believes in." Olivia stepped through the doors of the conference room just as Charles spoke her name, wearing the same composed expression she had carried all morning. Her navy blazer perfectly pressed, hair neatly arranged, notebook in hand. She paused at the threshold, allowing the impact of her presence to settle over the room. Her eyes scanned each executive, noting the mix of shock, disbelief, and lingering arrogance on their faces. Without a word, she walked to the center of the room, closed the distance between herself and Charles, and took a seat at the head of the table. Richard's jaw tightened. He had been confident, commanding this space for years, and now he realized he had been speaking in a room where he held no true authority. Charles handed Olivia the ribbon documents, which she opened with meticulous care, her eyes scanning each page, before looking up to meet Richard's gaze. "All decisions regarding this property," Olivia said in a steady, clear voice, "have been and will continue to be made in accordance with the trust's terms. It was necessary to observe without interference to understand the true functioning of this organization." A murmur ran through the board members. Some whispered to each other, the reality sinking in that the woman they had dismissed, the assistant they had underestimated, was the individual whose judgment, approval, and control could now affect their careers, their investments, and their futures. Richard found himself involuntarily leaning back, the enormity of the revelation pressing down on him. Monica tried to interject, but Olivia raised a single hand, halting the conversation. I will provide full oversight, guidance, and adjustments where necessary. This is not about punishment, but about realigning the company with its true values and potential. Cameras hidden in the ceiling silently recorded every reaction. Emails had begun pinging on tablets, some employees already receiving notification of the change in control. The tension that had once belonged entirely to Richard and the board was now shared across the room. A palpable energy shift from confidence to astonishment, from arrogance to measured respect. Olivia's calm, deliberate movements, the way she opened the documents, and the precision of her voice reinforced the authority she had quietly carried for years, the authority that no one had anticipated but which now reshaped the entire hierarchy of the company. Everyone present understood, even if only subconsciously, that the quiet observer had become the decisive power, and that their assumptions, their judgments, and their casual disregard had all been rendered irrelevant in the face of undeniable truth. For several long seconds, nobody in the conference room spoke. The silence carried more weight than any argument ever could. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the rain continued drifting across the Chicago skyline. But inside Hayes' corporate center, an entirely different storm was beginning to unfold. Richard Hayes slowly straightened in his chair and attempted to regain control of the meeting. Years of leadership had taught him how to project confidence even when circumstances shifted unexpectedly. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said carefully. "Ownership of the building and operational authority over the company are two separate matters." Several board members nodded hopefully, eager for an explanation that would restore the familiar hierarchy. Olivia listened without interruption. Her expression remained calm. "You are correct," she said. "They are separate matters." Relief briefly appeared on Richard's face. Then Olivia continued, "Which is why I have not said a single word about operational authority yet." The room froze again. Charles Whitaker opened another folder and slid several documents across the conference table. One by one, board members began reviewing them. Expressions changed almost immediately. Curiosity turned into confusion. Confusion turned into disbelief. Richard reached for the nearest document and scanned the first page. His confidence faded line by line. 5 years earlier, shortly after the death of the building's previous owner, a trust structure had been established. The trust not only controlled the property itself but also held significant voting rights connected to major corporate decisions involving long-term tenancy agreements, executive oversight provisions, and governance review mechanisms. Most executives had never bothered reading the details because they assumed those clauses would never matter. Now they mattered very much. Monica leaned forward. "This cannot be right," she said. "Why would nobody know about this?" Charles answered immediately. "Because the trust required confidentiality until the beneficiary determined otherwise." Richard looked directly at Olivia. "You intentionally hid this."
"No," Olivia replied.
"I simply never announced it." The distinction struck harder than anyone expected. Because it was true. Nobody had asked. Nobody had cared enough to ask. They had seen an assistant and decided they already understood her story. One board member cleared his throat. "If you have possessed this authority for years, why work here as an assistant?" Several people quietly wondered the same thing. Olivia folded her hands on the table. "Because reports tell you what people want you to see. Titles tell you what people want you to believe. But everyday behavior reveals the truth." Nobody interrupted. "I wanted to understand how employees were treated when nobody important was watching. I wanted to see whether respect depended on character or job title. I wanted to know whether leadership listened to people who had less power." Her eyes briefly moved toward Richard and Monica. "Now I know." The words landed with uncomfortable precision. Suddenly, dozens of small memories resurfaced throughout the room. Employees who had complained without being heard. Promotions that seemed unfair. Talented staff who quietly resigned. Suggestions dismissed because they came from people considered unimportant. Richard shifted in his chair. For the first time all day, he felt genuinely vulnerable. Then a notification appeared on multiple tablets around the room. One board member looked down and frowned. Another opened the message and inhaled sharply. Charles nodded toward the screens. You should read that. The notification came directly from the trust's auditors. An independent review had been underway for months. Employee surveys, financial records, internal communications, executive conduct reports, and management decisions had all been analyzed. The findings would be presented within the hour. As the executives stared at their screens, Olivia quietly closed her notebook. She had spent 5 years observing. The real meeting was only beginning. The conference room remained unnaturally quiet as executives scrolled through the audit notification on their tablets. The further they read, the more uncomfortable their expressions became. The report was not based on rumors, opinions, or isolated complaints. It was built on 5 years of documented observations, employee interviews, retention statistics, promotion records, and management decisions. Every conclusion was supported by evidence. Olivia watched silently as the information settled over the room. She had learned long ago that facts were often more powerful than arguments. One board member removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Another slowly closed his tablet as if hoping the findings might disappear. Richard continued reading, but the confidence that had defined him only hours earlier was fading rapidly. The report highlighted a pattern that nobody could easily dismiss. Departments with the highest turnover rates shared similar leadership structures. Employee satisfaction consistently declined after certain management changes. Internal recommendations from lower-level staff were routinely ignored, even when those recommendations later proved correct. Several promising employees had resigned after being repeatedly overlooked for advancement. Most troubling of all, multiple surveys revealed that workers felt respected only when they held titles that leadership considered important. Olivia finally spoke. The numbers surprised me at first. Her voice was calm and measured. Then I realized the numbers were simply reflecting behavior. Nobody challenged her. Charles Whitaker projected additional documents onto the large screen at the front of the room. Charts appeared. Timelines followed. Patterns became impossible to ignore. The data showed that employee performance often improved when managers listened to staff members closest to daily operations. Yet those same employees were rarely invited into meaningful discussions. Their ideas frequently resurfaced months later under different names and were credited to higher-ranking executives. Monica shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Every company has imperfections, she said. That does not mean leadership failed. Olivia nodded slightly. I agree. Several people looked surprised by the response. Perfection is not the standard, Olivia continued. Respect is. The room grew quiet again. Mistakes happen. Markets change. Strategies fail. But when people stop feeling valued, the foundation begins to crack long before financial reports show the damage. Her words resonated with more people than she realized. Around the table sat directors who had privately worried about company culture for years. They had seen talented employees leave. They had noticed growing frustration. But strong financial results had made those concerns easy to postpone. Now the evidence sat directly in front of them. Richard finally looked up from the report. If your goal was to improve the company, why stay silent for so long? Olivia met his gaze. Because I needed the truth. The answer lingered in the room. If people know they are being evaluated, they behave differently. I wanted to see what happened when nobody believed the person taking notes mattered. Several executives lowered their eyes. The realization was uncomfortable. The assistant they had ignored had witnessed conversations, decisions, and attitudes they never expected anyone important to remember. Then another notification appeared on the conference room screens. This one came directly from the Trust Oversight Committee. A special session had been approved. Effective immediately, a governance review would begin. Leadership performance, executive conduct, and organizational culture would all be examined in detail. The acquisition vote scheduled for that afternoon was officially postponed. Richard stared at the announcement in disbelief. Years of planning had suddenly been placed on hold. Across the table, Olivia quietly closed her notebook once more. The investigation she had started years earlier was finally moving into its next stage, and for the first time since entering the building as an assistant, everyone was paying attention to what she had to say. The postponed acquisition became the only topic anyone discussed throughout the building. By late afternoon, emails were circulating across departments. Managers were calling emergency meetings, and employees who had barely noticed Olivia during the past 5 years suddenly found themselves talking about her in hallways, break rooms, and elevators. Yet while speculation spread through every floor of the tower, Olivia remained focused on something far more important than reputation. She sat in a private conference room with Charles Whitaker and 3 representatives from the Oversight Committee, reviewing years of records that had never been shown to senior leadership. The documents revealed a story that financial reports alone could never tell. There were dozens of examples where employees had submitted ideas that increased efficiency, reduced expenses, or improved customer satisfaction, only to watch those ideas disappear without acknowledgement. There were promotion recommendations delayed for months without explanation. There were departments that consistently lost talented workers despite strong performance because employees felt invisible. None of the problems appeared catastrophic on their own. Together, however, they revealed a culture that rewarded status more often than contribution. Meanwhile, Richard sat alone in his office staring at the Chicago skyline. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about growth projections, investor expectations, or expansion plans. He was replaying conversations. Small moments returned to him with uncomfortable clarity. He remembered seeing Olivia working late after everyone else had gone home. He remembered passing her in hallways without learning anything about her. He remembered dismissing suggestions because they came from people he considered insignificant. The realization bothered him more than he wanted to admit. At 6 o'clock that evening, another meeting was called. This time the atmosphere was completely different. Nobody arrived feeling confident. Nobody assumed they understood what would happen next. When Olivia entered the room, every person stood instinctively. The gesture surprised even her. She thanked them and asked everyone to sit. Then she opened a folder and began sharing several examples from her observations. She never mentioned names. She never embarrassed anyone publicly. Instead, she focused on patterns. She spoke about respect, accountability, and the hidden cost of making employees feel unseen. The room listened carefully because every example felt familiar. Then she revealed something nobody expected. During her years as an assistant, she had personally interviewed hundreds of employees under the guise of routine administrative surveys. She had listened to receptionists, maintenance workers, interns, analysts, managers, and support staff. She knew their concerns. She knew their hopes. She knew which departments inspired loyalty and which created frustration. More importantly, she knew that the company's greatest strength was not its leadership team or its financial resources. Its greatest strength was the people whose names rarely appeared in executive presentations. Several board members exchanged thoughtful glances. They had spent years measuring success through numbers. Olivia was asking them to measure it through people. Then Charles distributed another set of documents. This report contained specific recommendations for organizational reform. New leadership evaluations.
Transparent promotion criteria.
Employee representation programs. Enhanced reporting systems. The changes were significant. Some would reshape the company entirely. As executives reviewed the proposals, a question quietly formed in many minds. If Olivia had spent 5 years studying the organization this carefully, what else had she discovered that nobody knew about yet? The following morning, Hayes Corporate Center felt like a different building. Employees arrived earlier than usual. Conversations became quieter when managers walked by. And for the first time in years, people seemed genuinely curious about what would happen next. The recommendations distributed the previous evening had spread throughout the company faster than anyone anticipated. Staff members who had once assumed their opinions did not matter were suddenly discussing leadership accountability, workplace culture, and opportunities for change. Some were hopeful. Others were cautious. Most simply waited. Inside the executive offices, however, the mood was far less optimistic. The Oversight Committee had begun examining communication records, promotion histories, departmental reviews, and management decisions from the previous 5 years. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was excluded. Every decision was being measured against the standards that leadership had publicly promised to uphold. Shortly before noon, another special session convened. Board members filled the conference room once again, but the atmosphere lacked the certainty that had defined earlier meetings. Richard entered quietly and took his seat without his usual confidence. Monica appeared equally unsettled. Both understood that the review was no longer theoretical. The findings were becoming increasingly specific. Charles Whitaker connected a presentation to the large screen at the front of the room. The first slide displayed a simple statement: organizational trust is built through consistent behavior. Olivia sat beside him, reviewing notes while committee members prepared their reports. One by one, examples appeared on the screen. Employee suggestions that had been ignored despite measurable benefits. Internal candidates passed over without documented justification. Departments receiving recognition for achievements created by teams that never received credit. None of the examples involved dramatic scandals. That was what made them so powerful. They revealed a pattern of everyday decisions that gradually weakened trust throughout the organization. Then the presentation shifted. A new category appeared: executive conduct review. The room grew noticeably quieter. Committee members began outlining situations where leadership behavior contradicted company values. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Richard remained expressionless, but his attention never left the screen. Then came the moment nobody expected. Charles displayed a series of employee testimonials collected over several years. Names were removed for privacy, but the messages carried undeniable emotional weight. Employees described feeling invisible. They described being judged by titles rather than contributions. They described watching talented colleagues leave because they believed nobody was listening. One statement captured the room completely. It read, "The people at the top always say our company feels like family, but families notice when someone is standing right in front of them." Nobody spoke after reading it. Olivia finally looked up from her notes. "That comment stayed with me," she said softly, "because the person who wrote it never expected anyone important to read it." Her words landed heavily across the room. Several board members lowered their eyes. They had spent years discussing growth, strategy, and profitability, while overlooking something far more fundamental: respect. Then Charles advanced to the final section of the report. This part contained recommendations regarding leadership accountability, independent evaluations, performance reviews for senior executives, new oversight requirements, transparent reporting standards. The reforms were substantial, and their approval seemed increasingly likely. As board members reviewed the proposals, another realization began spreading through the room. Olivia had not spent 5 years gathering information simply to expose problems. She had spent 5 years preparing solutions. And if she had already anticipated every weakness that appeared in the report, there was a very real possibility that the future leadership structure of the company had already begun taking shape long before anyone discovered who she truly was. 3 weeks later, the atmosphere inside Hayes Corporate Center felt almost unrecognizable. The changes approved by the board had moved from proposals to reality. Employee advisory panels had been established. Promotion reviews were being conducted through transparent standards. Department leaders were expected to meet directly with staff members instead of relying solely on reports and summaries. For many employees, it was the first time they felt their voices genuinely mattered. The transformation did not happen overnight, but people could feel it beginning. On a bright Monday morning, employees gathered in the main atrium for a company-wide meeting. Hundreds of workers filled the space. Some stood along the upper balconies overlooking the lobby. Others watched through live video streams from conference rooms throughout the building. Nobody knew exactly what Olivia planned to announce, but attendance was higher than any company meeting in recent memory. When she stepped onto the stage, the room immediately became quiet. She looked across the crowd she had spent years observing. Receptionists, analysts, maintenance staff, managers, interns, security officers, accountants, and executives all stood together. For the first time, there seemed to be fewer invisible people in the room. Olivia smiled softly before speaking. 5 years ago, I entered this building with a simple goal. I wanted to understand what happened when people believed nobody important was watching. A few employees exchanged knowing glances. What I discovered was not a company full of bad people. It was a company full of talented people who had stopped seeing one another clearly. The audience listened carefully. Many individuals worked incredibly hard. Many leaders genuinely wanted success. But somewhere along the way, job titles became more important than character. Position became more important than contribution. Assumptions became more powerful than understanding. Her words resonated because nearly everyone had experienced some version of that truth. Then Olivia announced a new initiative that would fund employee development, mentorship programs, continuing education opportunities, and internal career advancement for workers across every department. Applause filled the atrium. Some employees smiled. Others appeared genuinely emotional. They had expected restructuring. They had expected consequences. They had not expected investment. After the presentation ended, people slowly returned to their departments carrying a renewed sense of optimism. As the crowd dispersed, Richard Hayes remained near the back of the atrium. During the previous weeks, he had undergone extensive review and chosen to step away from his executive position. The decision had not been easy, yet for the first time in years, he found himself reflecting honestly on the difference between authority and leadership. As he prepared to leave the building, he noticed Olivia standing near the lobby entrance speaking with several employees. For a moment he considered walking away. Instead, he approached her. The conversation around her gradually paused. Richard stopped a few feet away and looked at the woman he had once dismissed without understanding. "I spent years believing I knew how to evaluate people," he said quietly. "I was wrong." Olivia listened without judgment. Richard extended his hand. "Congratulations, Ms. Bennett." The title carried a respect that had been absent before. Olivia accepted the gesture with a gracious smile. "Thank you, Richard." There was no triumph in her voice. No bitterness. Only calm understanding. Richard nodded and walked toward the exit. As the revolving doors turned and sunlight spilled across the polished lobby floor, Olivia watched employees moving through the building she had quietly protected for years. The lesson she hoped they would remember had never been about ownership, power, or hidden wealth. It was much simpler than that. Every person carries a story that cannot be measured by a title, and the moment people learn to see one another fully is often the moment everything begins to change.
Before you leave, take a moment to think about Olivia's story. Many people believe power belongs to the loudest voice in the room. But Olivia showed that true strength often appeared in a quieter way. She never demanded attention or recognition. When she was humiliated, she responded with dignity instead of anger. Her story reminds us that how easily we judge people by their appearance, titles, or assumptions. Richard's greatest mistake wasn't a poor decision. It was failing to see another person clearly. The lesson isn't about Olivia, it's about all of us. How often do we overlook the quiet person in a room? How often do we underestimate someone before we know the story? Respect should never be reserved for powerful. The quiet person standing in the background might carry a story, talent, or the truth that can change everything tomorrow. Never underestimate character, never underestimate kindness, never underestimate the person who don't feel need to prove who they are. If you like this video, remember to like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment below. Thank you.